Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. In yesterday's episode, dealing with Watts' reaction to the question, did you see her before she went to work? We went through some of his reactions, some of his stuttering, some of his patterns. One aspect that I neglected to mention that's of course really important is the whole context of where this is happening. Watts is standing below the stairs. He's got an officer in front of him, between him and the front door. He's also got an officer to his left, beside the column. And to Watts' right is the basement, and the basement door's open. And further down that passage is the garage. Now we know for a fact that Watts would have moved through there to carry the bodies to his truck. So in other words, he would have moved into the garage, through the garage, out the garage, onto the driveway several times as he was loading bodies into the truck. Now this is obviously speculation, but I believe that the 3 bodies were placed in the basement after they died. The children may have died in the basement. I don't think so, but I guess it's possible. But I believe that all 3 bodies were left in the basement to be sequestrated from the crime scene. Also, if somebody happened to come in or something like that, Watts needed to clean the house before he left. He needed to clean himself. He needed to wash clothes and clean up behind him. And so he would have wanted the bodies out the way. It's not clear where he would have put Dieter when this was happening, but I doubt whether Dieter was in the basement at the same time. You never know, but I doubt it. It's also possible that there was refrigeration going on in the basement. I don't really want to go into that, but the aspect that I think is the most important to talk about is when Watts is being asked these questions, look at where he's standing. And he's got to be thinking about what was going on just hours before in that very spot that he's standing, what he was doing hours before. And just think about how nervous he must be. He's got 2 policemen. I think there was also a third standing just out of camera at around about this time. I also think Detective Baumhover went next door to speak to the neighbor privately. And so you can imagine how nervous Watts was. He's in his house hours earlier, he's done what he's done, and he's trying to cover his tracks. And he's trying to sound convincing when he says, they were sleeping when he left, and Shan'ann said she was going to a friend, but Watts isn't a very good actor. Again, the part I just want to emphasize is, think about where he's standing in the context of what we know happened. We know he walked through the garage. We think that he went down into the basement. Whether you believe Shan'ann was killed or attacked on the stairs or on top of the stairs, it doesn't really matter in terms of she would have had to come halfway down the stairs or all the way down the stairs and then through that passageway where Watts is standing. The same applies to the children. If the children were killed upstairs, I don't believe they were killed upstairs either, but for those who do, he would have had to have carried 3 bodies from upstairs, downstairs, all the way through that route. So where Watts is standing is actually standing in his crime scene, trying to convince the police that he had nothing to do with their disappearance. So that was just one aspect that I didn't fully address in the previous episode. Something else I meant to address kind of in a different way was regarding the fact that Chris Watts has been sued for $6 million. And the part that I meant to emphasize there was that that is the value that the lawyers basically feel Chris Watts may be worth in terms of book rights and all that kind of thing. And for me, that's just an interesting number, given that I write books for a living. I've had my movie rights contracted for, and so it's just interesting to think that, Chris Watts' book deals, movie rights might be worth ultimately 6 million. Who knows? Maybe they won't be. But an enterprising journalist or someone might go to Watts and say, well, if you really want to even the scales, if you really want to make up for what you did, tell me your story. We'll sell the rights and we'll give the money to the Ruseks. And obviously whoever does that would also profit from it. Watts wouldn't, but it would be one way of maybe making something out of a disaster. I'm not saying I would do it, but I'm saying it's certainly possible in the scheme of things. Whether Watts would go along with it, I don't know. Whether any movie producer would succeed, I don't know. But who knows? Who knows what will happen? There are already quite a few books out, and the little cottage industries spawning around Chris Watts on YouTube and elsewhere are certainly interesting. For those interested in my latest book, my 95th book, Murder Most Foul, it's available on Amazon. One of my, super fans has just let me know how much she loved the book, and I would rather not sort of do a YouTube video saying how great my book is. I would rather have someone come on and have a conversation. So that's likely to happen quite soon on Patreon. Just talking about the book, but also talking about Patrick Frazee. He's very different to Chris Watts, and in many ways he's very similar. The particular reader highlighted the fact that I called Patrick Frazee a monster, whereas I don't call Chris Watts a monster. And that's something we're going to discuss, and that'll be on Patreon probably quite soon this week. I'll also be continuing my analysis of Criminal Confessions. I'm gearing up to cover something related to the iCloud information. Whether that's going to be on YouTube or Patreon, I'm not quite sure at this point, but we'll see. In any event, let's get on to what else do we know, number 4. But before we get there, please subscribe to this channel, like, share, leave a comment, ring the bell if you want notifications. And let's get started. So in episode 4 we pick up the chronology at number 56, and we'll be going all the way through to 68. 12 points, but some of them are quite long, and hopefully this isn't going to take too long. I've got to be up very early tomorrow morning doing a 100+ bike ride, and I need to get this wrapped up. As I said, some of these points are quite long, but let's get going. Point 56, Shan'ann met Chris online during a dark period 8 years before the murder, and that is from a People magazine article. Now it's tempting just to cycle past that seemingly obvious fact, but the point is that Shan'ann met Chris online and Chris met Shan'ann online, and we might think there's nothing strange about that. People meet each other online all the time, but what I'd like you to think about is, have you had online dates and online relationships that were brokered online, and then have you had other relationships where you met people through the course of your interactions at work or through friends or through family, and sort of how did that work out? Now it's not to say one way or the other. It's not to say that the one version is better or worse, right? But I think we can all agree, just in a general sense, that when you meet someone through the course of your normal daily life, so whether it's at work or someone living in your neighborhood or someone who's part of your jogging group, or someone that you bump into at the grocery store often, or whatever it is, it tends to be someone who you have something in common with in a real sense. In other words, their life literally, the path of their life literally connects with the path of your life, and probably has been doing so for some time. So it's almost as if your fates are, if not connected, then certainly on a trajectory where you would have encountered one another at some point anyway. As soon as you meet online, that is a little bit different, because the persona that you're putting online is not necessarily true or accurate. It might be, and also from the other person the same thing. If you don't like this line of questioning, and maybe you met your partner online, the point I'm simply trying to make is ultimately this union didn't succeed, didn't survive, and it was in a way undermined by what I would then call a real world relationship, which was where Chris Watts encountered someone at work, someone that he bumped into every single day, someone who bumped into Chris Watts every single day. It was two people who encountered one another doing other things, doing work related things, and within this environment they felt that they had various things in common, and they did. And one could also argue that Chris Watts had more in common with Kissinger than he ever had in common with Shan'ann. I must say, when I look at pictures of Chris Watts and Shan'ann from not immediately just before the crime, but fairly old pictures, so maybe a couple of months old, they seem like quite a sweet couple. But the same can be said for Kissinger and Watts. They also seem like a very compatible couple. So, it's not to say that compatibility is carved in stone. One can be compatible and become less compatible. But my point is simply that meeting someone online isn't necessarily the best way of forging a future with somebody else. It can be, but then it depends on what happens from there onwards, and what one's past was leading up to this moment of meeting online. Bear in mind, when you meet someone in the real world, you're seeing them exactly the way they are. They're not hiding behind an avatar. They're not hiding behind sort of grandiose updates or whatever. There's not Photoshop. It's what you see is what you get, and so I'm just saying there's an authentic quality to meeting someone in the real world compared to meeting someone online. Shan'ann in April 2018 said, "I believe that everything in life happens for a reason, and I also believe people are placed in our life for a reason." And that was something she said in April 2018, and of course that was very close to the time Shan'ann got pregnant for the third time. And think about those words in relation to that. Think about those words in relation to her falling pregnant for the third time. Oh, did that happen for a reason? Was Nico placed in Shannann's life and Chris Watts' life and Kissinger's life for a reason? Now you might think I'm being unfair by thinking about this way. Someone might say, well, Shannann's not here to defend herself. But there are many people who say these things. In fact, someone said it to me just the other day, that I think everything happens for a reason. And if you believe that, then that's true. So if you believe that something happens in your life for a reason, then maybe you don't understand why it happens, but then you just say, well, I think it happens for a reason, and then you go along with it. Maybe someone's in your life and then you decide that they're in your life for a reason. But what if they're not? What if they're not there for a good reason? What if having a third child isn't a good idea? What if the husband you're with or the partner you're with isn't there for a very good reason? And if that's the case, then thinking they're there for a reason isn't very good. It's basically just your belief. So your belief is forcing them to be there for a reason when they shouldn't be. And so the timing of this is really crucial. It reminds me quite a lot of another case, Oscar Pistorius. I also studied in depth Reeva Steenkamp, his victims' Facebook posts. I was actually friends with her on Facebook before the crime happened, and she was saying how months before her death, she died on Valentine's Day in 2013, about 6 years ago, more than 6 years ago. She was saying, sort of on New Year's, around New Year's Day, how she was going to make that year her best year, and how she was going to be stronger, and all sorts of things, all sorts of things around this idea of things happening for a reason, and believing in destiny. And then she died 2 months later, and Reeva knew how she was arguing with Oscar prior to her death. Reeva knew that he was, or thought she knew that Oscar was cheating on her, or not being completely faithful to her. And so despite her giving herself these affirmations, they didn't really help her. And I say this with sympathy to all of us, because all of us put affirmations up on social media, and they don't really do any good. Sort of repeating affirmations don't help you. Being in the real world helps you. Being off social media helps you, not repeating affirmations all the time. And in this respect, I sort of came across something recently in, I think it was the Oxygen documentary. I think they briefly showed the inside of Shan'ann's office or something, and then you saw the affirmations on a mirror. And I must say, when I saw that in the original Thrive video, I don't know if it still exists, but it was a sort of a Thrive get-together in Shan'ann's home, where all the Thrivers got together and they sort of put their affirmations all over the place, sort of sticky taped on notes throughout the lounge and so on, and then they would read them out, and they would say, since I've tried Thrive, I've smiled more than ever. Since I've tried Thrive, I haven't felt like I haven't been depressed. Since I've tried Thrive, I've been kinder to my children, or whatever it was. And there was something cult-like about it, and you sort of wonder, how many people in their own personal lives put post-its around their mirrors telling them or reminding themselves of how great their jobs are. That insert the name of your job and say, this job makes me smile. But that you've got to read it to remember that that's the case. So one's got to be careful with affirmations that you're not turning them into your gospel. Affirmations are different to things that are self-evidently true. And self-evidently true things don't even need to be sold. You don't need to promote or advertise things that are just ordinarily healthy, which is why you never have adverts for fruit and vegetables. You never have adverts for glasses of water to drink or sunshine. If you need vitamin D, you just go out into the sun. But the pill manufacturers would rather you bought the pills than get it naturally. Drug makers would rather you take flu medication than that you stay fit. So things that are self-evidently healthy don't need affirmations. You don't need to be reminded of it, except in a world that's forgotten what is healthy. And this brings us to point number 58, a half-hour Facebook Live clip, which I posted right at the bottom of the review of the timeline. And I think the reason that I transcribed so much of it was because I thought it would eventually be deleted or lost or simply just taken down. But I've always felt that that particular clip, that half-an-hour clip, is an incredible statement of identity, a statement of intent. It's not necessarily the truth of Shan'ann Watts, but it's certainly an important kind of mission statement. If it's not Shan'ann, then it's who Shan'ann wants to be. If it's not Shan'ann, it's who Shan'ann is trying to be. But I think a lot of it is also Shan'ann, and we get an extended view of her. It's not just 5 minutes, it's a very long view, and we see her moods fluctuate. We see her being at times pensive, at times almost teary-eyed, at times happy and even delighted, at times anticipating the future, at times wistful. So we see quite a spectrum of her moods just through that half an hour on a Saturday morning in April 2018. In the first few minutes, Shan'ann comments about her younger daughter's restlessness, and she's talking about CC and says, "This child does not sit still, ever." And this was one of the first times that we'd heard any kind of description about CC, and you don't really know what that means. You think that what that means is that CC doesn't sit still, or that she's just restless. But the question is, how much? Compared to other children, compared to Bella, what was what was the impact of CC's restlessness on the family dynamic? What was the impact of CC's restlessness on Bella, and just on the stress of the family? And this is normal stress. It's a 2-year-old that's rambunctious and all this kind of thing. And as we know, it was because of concerns over CC that Nutgate happened. It was concerns that something could happen to CC that all hell ultimately broke loose. And one wonders if CC was a sort of a quieter child, a calmer child. Maybe the chances of her grabbing a scoop of ice cream that could have harmed her would just have been less. If she was... So who knows to what extent that factored into it. But of course at this point we didn't know. I don't think we even knew about Nutgate, and we didn't really know what it meant. That was CC just not being able to sit still then. But you can see how CC sort of running around can actually impact on the general level of stress and anxiety of the family. And a post that I want to make at one point is, why was Dieter allowed to survive? Why were the children killed but the dog was allowed to survive? And it may seem like a silly question with a silly answer, but it's actually got quite profound implications when you think about it seriously. If you think about Dieter from Kessinger's perspective, but through Chris Watts thinking about Kessinger's perspective, Dieter's not a threat to Kessinger. Dieter's not going to take time away from Kessinger. They can walk the dogs together or whatever it is. And then there's also the fact of the expense. Is Dieter expensive to maintain? There's a lot more to it than that, but it's certainly an interesting thing to think about. Number 59, at 10 minutes into the clip, Shan'ann says, "No matter what you do, you just have to love what you do. And I love what I do." When she tries to illustrate it with examples, Shan'ann thinks and apologizes for rambling. It's an interesting moment because one can't help wondering, are you really happy? And so this was just my interpretation at the time, and I'm not sure whether 18 months later my thinking has evolved much from there, which is simply to say, was Shan'ann happy doing the whole Thrive thing? Was she happy doing it on the weekend of her murder? Or was she happy having to go to North Carolina to do it? Obviously on Facebook Live she must say that she's enjoying herself and she loves what she's doing. But as I say, when she tries to illustrate what's so enjoyable about doing all these Thrive things, Shan'ann tries to think about it, and then she sort of apologizes for rambling, which means she doesn't seem to be able to genuinely think of what's so enjoyable about selling these powders online. And I think a case can be made that social media makes us unhappy. You spend a lot of time looking at other people, comparing yourself, and almost wanting to be somewhere that you're not, and wanting to be someone that you're not. And that's, if you spend so much time on social media doing that, it seems that you're more invalidated than validated. And at any moment there's an opportunity to be invalidated when someone doesn't agree with what you say, or someone, you, and that's something else we'll get to, is where Shan'ann talks about how many people have blocked her and unfriended her and criticized her, people that are just not on board with the whole MLM thing. And that's a constant thing, and that's something that can't make you feel particularly happy, where a whole swathe of people would be sort of saying, I'm not interested, this is, I'm not seriously into the stuff that you are trying to sell me, leave me alone. And if you look into Shan'ann's office, for someone who is very OCD and very organized, her office seems fairly chaotic. Granted, she hadn't been home for a while, but it doesn't quite speak of the orderliness of the rest of the home. And that's not a criticism of Shan'ann's housekeeping. It's looking at the impact of multi-level marketing on Shan'ann trying to keep the Watts ship afloat. And we know that they were struggling. We know what their basement looked like. And this brings us to point number 60, and in the original blog post it's put below a crowd attending a candlelit vigil in front of the Watts home. And this echoes something that she posted on her Instagram, where she says, I will continue not letting the haters get in my way. I will continue not to be discouraged. I will continue not letting people judge me or what I do. I will continue to not let people influence my decisions on what I do in life. I will continue fighting for my children, for my husband, for myself. Shan'ann seems a little tearful here, and nobody's going to hold me back from my future, my kids' future. No one's going to tell me the right way of living life. No one's going to tell me what I should and shouldn't do for a job. Like, if I'm bringing in income and taking care of my family, then I'm being a better mom than I've, with emphasis, ever been, because I'm here. You have to be strong. You have to be confident. You have to be you at the end of the day. What does Shan'ann mean by this? Chris is in the room with her. Is she saying what she's saying purposely to communicate with him? And so I think it's very instructional to think of those words again in the context of what was about to play out. What was about to happen in terms of Nutgate, which literally happened around about 2 months after this, and then what happened to the whole family about a month after that. And just think about these words in that context. I will continue not letting the haters get in my way. I will continue not to be discouraged. I will continue not letting people judge me or what I do. I will continue to not let people influence my decisions on what I do in life. I will continue fighting for my children, for my husband, for myself. No one's going to hold me back from my future, my kids' future. No one's going to tell me the right way of living life. No one's going to tell me what I should and shouldn't do for a job. And so Shan'ann's murderer is sitting right there, and what he's hearing is, no one's going to tell me what to do. No one's going to get in my way. And ultimately, Chris Watts did get in her way. Ultimately, Chris Watts did hold Shan'ann back from her future and from her kids' future. Ultimately, someone did get in the way of Shan'ann living the right way of living life. Think about that in the context of the divorce. And think about this in the context of, would Watts have wanted to talk to Shan'ann about getting a divorce when you've heard something like that? No one's going to tell me the right way of living life, or what I should and shouldn't do. I'm not going to let someone judge me. I'm not going to be discouraged. Now think of, in the context of a divorce and things not going well, maybe you should be discouraged. Maybe you should realize, well, this isn't working out. Sometimes it's good to be discouraged when you're on the wrong path. You shouldn't let haters get in your way, but you should sometimes let reality get in your way so that you can look at it. And so, in a sensitive way, in a compassionate way, we just want to look at those words and think about the implications for Shan'ann, but just in general, when one has makes those sort of statements about one's own life. Maybe not in the context of murder, but in the context of life trying to steer us in a certain direction, and maybe we need to pay attention to the way we're being steered. What are the larger forces at work? Do we see them? Do we know them? Are we able to adapt? Are we able to recognize the signals? Are we able to deal with our reality? Or is reality going to deal with us? Is reality going to hide from us because it knows how we deal with reality? And that brings us to point number 61. You're on top of the world when you surround yourself with people that make you better. Like, they don't bring the bad out of you, they bring the good out of you. And from that point on, I fought like hell. I worked my tail off, I busted my butt. I was never a big dreamer sort of thing, because my insecurities brought me down. But I was single for a long time, gulps emotionally, and my goal was to buy a house. I was tired of paying someone else's mortgage, because that's what you do when you rent. And I wanted to buy a house. And I wanted to buy a house that I could resell one day and make a profit off of. And so I worked and worked and worked and worked. I lost a lot of friends because a lot of my friends were still young. And I was 25 years old when I built my first house. My family doesn't come from money. We always worked hard for what we had. And I did. I bought my first house at 25 years old. And that was the biggest accomplishment I felt I've ever done, because it felt like I did it by myself. I did it by working my tail off. And she laughs. And I had that to show for it. And then I met Chris. My health challenges happened. I was diagnosed with health challenges, gulps emotionally. And then I met Chris. I met Chris because of those health challenges. My friend actually sent me a friend suggestion for him. It was actually from his cousin's wife, and I deleted it. Like, I'm not interested. I don't want to meet a guy. So I deleted a friend suggestion for him. This is echoes of Lacey Peterson writing a message on a note, or was it a napkin, for Scott Peterson, and Scott throwing it away. And then ultimately Scott recovering it and calling her. It echoes this notion that lives can be made or broken on such fickle behavior. Such small moments is frightening. I remember being in a bar once, and someone was sitting near to me, and I think I asked for a sip of something that she was drinking. And I was in two minds about asking, but I asked, and that then led to a 2-year relationship. But I was just as close to not asking as asking. And quite a lot happened before, after, and during that relationship. But the point is here, if you think about this friend suggestion and that Shan'ann originally deleted, what if Shan'ann had not responded to it? Would she have missed out on the fairy tale? Would she also have missed out on the nightmare? And what do we make of this biggest achievement that Shan'ann achieved as a 25-year-old, when less than 10 years later she was facing 2 bankruptcies? What do we make of the health challenges she had, and then her situation 9 years later? If Shan'ann was capable of earning so well and earning so much to buy a house at 25, then why 9 years later could she not hold on to another house at 33, 34? And it does make you wonder, how much of this is a spiel and how much of this is genuine and credible and admirable. anyone overcoming health challenges, whether it's being overweight, whether it's being sickly or unfit, is commendable, and it looks like Shan'ann did. I mean, when we see her in the last months of her life, she looks healthy, she looks happy, she's already had 2 children, she's on the ball in a way, she's on the ball in terms of her life, but what she doesn't realize is she's not on the ball perhaps of her finances and also of her marriage. And what Nutgate shows is that it's a kind of an almost a sinister or satirical episode or anecdote that turns on its head this idea of being on top of the world when you surround yourself with people that make you better. So what if you're with family that don't? You just cut them out of your life. Another aspect just to address, because I've certainly got it in common with Shan'ann, is one can fight like hell and work your tail off and bust your butt, but sometimes you need to stop. Sometimes you need to give up and throw in the towel and go a different route. Sometimes you shouldn't just keep fighting and keep pushing and keep working your tail off. Sometimes you've got to find another way or a better way. And just a little anecdote on this, I remember I was on a cycling tour once and I got sick during the tour, and I got sicker and sicker and sicker, but I was determined not to stop, and eventually a bandana I had around my neck, or some kind of, not scarf, but some material blew off my neck because I had a sore throat, and ended up in my chain, and it snapped my chain, and so I wasn't able to continue riding. Not because I chose not to, which would have been a stronger decision, but because of that, because my derailleur broke. And so what that sort of taught me was sometimes you need to say no to yourself, to what you want, to accept and maybe acknowledge that certain things aren't meant to be. If you're going to say that things always happen for a reason, sometimes things don't happen for a reason, and sometimes you can stop going down a road because you recognize that. Maybe that's harder. So there's a lot of kind of heavy, deep stuff here. For me, it's a little bit like where angels fear to tread, because it feels like one is judging Shan'ann, and I think the only way to be genuine about it is to be authentic about things that you've been through, to say, I did that, and that's what happened, and we all go through these sort of things. But we're not just talking about Shan'ann in this context, we're talking about Shan'ann in the context of this, and months later it would all be undone. The fairy tale would be over. The nightmare would also be permanent. And that brings us to point number 62. I was diagnosed 2 months later, and I went through, I would say, one of the darkest times of my life, because things just got scarier, worse. I thought my life was crumbling underneath me, and I didn't know which way to turn. I didn't have a lot of friends at the time, and then a dog barks. Friends I did have, I lost, because they didn't understand that I looked perfectly fine, and I felt horribly inside. Horribly. I felt a lot of discomforts, a lot of aches, a lot of bad moods. I met a lot of friends online, and in the part where I gave up on everything, I quit my job. It was kind of temporarily, of 9 years. I just said, I'm done, I can't do this anymore. You don't understand me, you don't understand what's going on in my life, and I quit. And I got a friend request from Chris, and Shan'ann smiles. And so there are echoes here of something else, which is where Shan'ann knows she looks perfectly fine, but she feels horrible inside. And isn't that a lot of what the Thrive thing is, what the MLM thing is? Maybe there are times when you feel good inside, and maybe there are times that things are good. But what about when times are bad? Are you allowed to say that in your Thrive promos? Because if there's one thing that Chris Watts has said, not only to Kessinger but also to law enforcement, he said Shan'ann wouldn't let him be himself. And it's almost like what Shan'ann's saying is that with Chris, he let her be herself, but kind of at his expense. The part that True Crime Rocket Science would highlight here is where Shan'ann talks about things getting scarier. You know, the darkest time of her life and things getting scarier, and her life crumbling underneath her, and she didn't know which way to turn. And her friends were online. And this was all, I think, 9 years ago, but it was also what her life was like in 2018. Things were getting scarier. She was in the darkest time of her life. She just didn't know it. That last weekend. And all her friends were online, although some of them were less online than others. But it was because she was not online that Nicole Atkinson knew something was wrong. Point number 63, I was in a really bad place, and I got a friend request from Chris on Facebook. And I was like, what the heck, I'm never going to meet him, except. It's not clear what she really means here. You know, she earlier said that she got a friend suggestion that she deleted. So it's maybe possible that there was a friend suggestion, and then Chris Watts himself requested Shan'ann as a friend, but there is a bit of, you know, both referring to a suggestion and a friend request, which I guess is kind of interesting. Obviously it's less romantic if Shan'ann responded to a friend's suggestion in terms of Chris Watts than whether Chris reached out to her directly on Facebook. It would be good to get clarity on that. But I mean, one thing we do know for sure just from the story is that Chris's cousin suggested Chris, and so maybe she did delete it, and maybe Chris did suggest or send through a friend request directly. In Sherilyn Cadle's book, she also refers to sort of both aspects of the story, is that there was a cousin who recommended Chris, and then there was Chris himself who apparently made a friend request. So it's not clear if they were both, but it does seem that the cousin interceded on Chris's behalf. And again, one can just see how the fate of Shan'ann, her children, her unborn child, even Chris Watts, rested on that click of the button, where if Shan'ann didn't accept, everything could have been completely different. She may have had a completely different life. She may have never gone to Colorado. Number 64. Well, one thing led to another, and 8 years later we have 2 kids, gushes breathlessly. We live in Colorado, and he's the best thing that has ever happened to me. And because of my health challenges, because I got so sick, I let him in. And he only knew me at that time. He knew me at my worst, and he accepted me. And one wonders what should have thought about this, because Shan'ann at her worst in terms of herself, when she was weak and dependent and sick, was maybe the Shan'ann that Chris Watts fell in love with, a vulnerable woman and someone who needed him. And when she was strong and maybe one could say at her best in her eyes, you know, when she was strutting her stuff on social media and in control and a dominant personality, then he didn't accept her. Then he didn't think she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Isn't that an irony? Number 65, and Shan'ann brushes the hair off her face. You know, through your vows, like through sickness and everything, he's been there. He was the only one who let me lay on him and fall asleep for 3.5 hours on his lap while he had to pee. He's the best thing that has ever happened to me. And of course this is not true. Chris Watts was the worst thing that ever happened to Shan'ann, ultimately. And that's what one has got to look at, is how does the best become the worst? And how does the worst become the best? And so, I've done a blog post on this. Who changed the most through the course of their marriage? Did Shan'ann change more than Chris Watts? Did Chris Watts change more? And I think there are different answers to that. We're not going to go into them here, but they both changed in different ways, and they both changed in ways where they kind of grew apart from each other. Both of them, I think, became stronger people as their finances crumbled around them. But I think they both became stronger people in the sense of what they wanted, and perhaps what they didn't want. Number 66, know that no matter how hard life gets, no matter how low you feel, know that deep down, like in your heart, that there's a purpose, there's a reason for everything. We may not understand it at the time. It's hard to understand it at the time. And she laughs. And if you think of those words, what was the purpose or the reason for what happened to Shan'ann? She's saying there's a purpose and there's a reason for everything. What is the purpose and the reason for what happened to her? What would she say if she could stand with us? What would she say was the purpose and the reason? What could anyone say? What is the purpose and the reason for the children needing to die? Surely it's not just Nicole Kessinger. Surely it's not just the money. Surely it's not just the difficulty in going through with a divorce. And Shan'ann says, we may not understand it at the time, but she says, I'm telling you, when I met Chris, I pushed him away. I gave every excuse for him to run. I gave him an out every single day. I gave him an out. And then one looks at what was going on at the end. Did Shan'ann give him an out? Did she say, if you want to go, go? Well, she did actually say that. She did say, if you're done, tell me, and then, and then that's it. And although she was asking him, what was ringing in his ears was Nutgate, was, okay, if you're done, you can go, but what's going to happen? What has been happening the last couple of months? What has been happening the last couple of years? And then Shan'ann continues, and if you guys know my story with Chris, I gave him an out. And she's talking about early on. I mean, he went to my colonoscopy. I tortured him. I rejected him. I pushed him away time and time again. But when I cancelled dates last minute, because that's how life is with my health challenges, you cancel things last minute, and it's hard for people to get. It's hard for me to understand, but he stuck around. And he stuck around because he was the one for me. And he's amazing, and I can't tell you how wonderful he is. And this is kind of ironic, is where Shan'ann says he stuck around because he was the one for me. Is that the reason Chris Watts stuck around? Because of that sort of belief that you're the one? What happens when you believe that someone's no longer the one? Then do you not stick around? And I think what one's got to bear in mind here is that this past time where Shan'ann says she tortured him, I rejected him, I pushed him away, I cancelled dates, I cancelled things last minute, whatever. If Chris Watts proved his love for Shan'ann, I think what was also proved during that time was that Watts went through a lot to win over Shan'ann. Watts went through a lot to deserve her, whatever the thing is. And when Watts suddenly found himself feeling differently about her, I think maybe he recognized that if he pushed her away, what that would awaken in her. Number 67, but on top of all that, when I got sick, I reached out to support groups online, and I built relationships with so many people that have similar health challenges or the same. And we've built relationships stronger than some relationships I've known for over 20 years, some that I've known my whole life, and these people are in my life for a reason. And here she seems to be talking about online relationships. Number 68, life happens. a dog barks, probably Dita, and Shan'ann snaps her finger. And she says, so write down all the things you think are bad in your life, all the negative in your life, write it down. And she sniffs. She seems quite emotional here again. She seems quite sensitive and vulnerable. And she's referring to the bad things in her life, or in one's life. And then she says, but then I want you to, on the other side of the paper, write down what has happened in your life that you're grateful for. Maybe this is what she's thinking to herself, there are bad things going on, but what is she grateful for? And then she says the third step is take a pen and mark over, like connect the two things that have happened. And that's effectively what True Crime Rocket Science does in these cases. So we look at the dynamics between the perpetrator and the victim. We look at the good sides in the perpetrator and the bad sides in the perpetrator. We look at the challenges faced by the victim and the dynamics in their various identities and how they connect to one another, but then also how they rub each other the wrong way within a set of circumstances that ultimately feels like it's inevitable. What is going to happen feels inevitable. And you get to that point when you knit together a narrative that includes all the aspects, all the circumstances, all the forensic evidence, all the dynamics, and then you put it through a timeline, and you just see how these tensions build up. And we referred to Shan'ann being afraid earlier on. One of the responses of all human beings when you're afraid or when you're fearful is you want to take control. So if you want to make someone afraid or anxious or stressed, take away their control. If you want to address fear, you regain control. And the question is, how do you regain control? In Shan'ann's case, how you regain control is you have schedules, and you have regimented timelines and schedules and things that you stick to. And we know very well that Shan'ann stuck to a very regular timetable with her life. She put things in boxes and labels, and she color-coded things, and there were t-shirts and all that kind of thing with words on them, walls with words on them. The walls in her house with words on them were mirrored by the walls, the walls on Facebook with words on them. And now, sadly, all that remains of Shan'ann are her words. We have her words, and they live on, and it's strange reading them given what we know, and the meaning of those words seem to change over time as time passes and our understanding of this case passes by. Our knowledge of who these people were deepens and widens. The meanings and the import behind these words seems to also change. And so what seems to come across as kind of a lesson here is as self-aware Shan'ann seemed to be, as aware as she was in April about her past and her present and what she wanted for her future. Disaster was waiting for her nonetheless. And so one of the questions is, if you are looking at your life with your eyes open, how do you not see what is happening? Why do you not see what is happening? And in your fear, is the way that you're gaining control, is it helping you to see what is happening, or is it helping you not to see? Okay, and I'm not going to take it any further than this. It's been a very deep episode, certainly a lot longer than I meant it to be. But thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed to this channel, please do. Like, share, and leave a comment, and I'll see you guys next time.